All right, we've got most of the folks. We're going to get started now. So welcome. Thanks for joining us for another amazing Roebling road trip. A big thank you also to everyone who made a donation. All of our programs during the pandemic have been pay what you wish as a way to support our community. So every donation of any amount really does help our museum run programs, as well as to work on our mission, which is to collect and preserve Roebling's history. My name is Lynn Calamia, and I'm the new executive director. Well, I started right before the pandemic hit, so I'm still saying I'm new because it's been a crazy couple of years, but some of you may have actually met me by now. But I've been having a really good time learning about the town and also meeting the people who currently call Roebling home. So for those of you who haven't visited yet, we are actually open on Saturdays now, so you should all come for a visit in December. Roebling itself is in central New Jersey on the Delaware River. Our company town is listed on the National Register. It was built in 1905 and remains almost fully intact architecturally. It's really great to experience that. Our museum is on the site of the former Roebling wire rope factory and steel mill. And our indoor and outdoor exhibits and programs really work to bring to life the story of the people who lived and worked in the company town, as well as to share the big impact of the Roebling family and the Roebling company. So today we're going to go on a Roebling road trip. And for those of you who are first timers, the Roebling Road Trip program series, it's a virtual program that takes viewers around the country to visit people at Roebling related sites or to talk with people who research Roebling related topics. So far, we've been to a bridge in Cincinnati, the Allegheny Portage Railroad, Saxonburg, which is the town founded by John Roebling, and the Brooklyn Bridge, and there's more on its way. So if anybody who's tuned in now has ideas for future Roebling road trips, please let me know, because we're always looking for new great programs. I just want to take 1 second to talk about how this program today is going to run. So our guest, Jeffrey Richman, he's going to give an illustrated lecture, and I do place an emphasis on illustrated. He's got a lot of really great photos to share with us today. And while he's doing that, you guys are all going to submit questions. So whatever comes to you, type it in the Q&A box, not the chat box. And I will, while he's talking, manage the questions so that as soon as he's done, we can do a Q&A afterwards, keeping an eye on the time. So I wanted to keep my intro remarks short so we can get started. And without further ado, welcome, Jeffrey.
Well, thank you very much, Lynn. I've been very much looking forward to this. Anything with Roebling is good with me. And so in 1983, I loaned some stereo views to an exhibition for the centennial of the bridge at the Smithsonian. And when I went to visit, there I was, Richman, alphabetized right before Paul Roebling. So that was kind of a thrill for me. So I've been a big fan of the Brooklyn Bridge for many years. I've been collecting materials pertaining to the bridge for 40 plus years. And an opportunity kind of developed several years ago for me to create this book out of three great collections, one of which I have donated to the Greenwood Historic Fund. I'm the historian at Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn. And a friend of mine who has the best collection of New York City views, and another friend who had outbid me on a lot of 25 stereo views of the Brooklyn Bridge. And so bringing that together, plus material from archives and from a wonderful collection of woodcuts, allowed me to do this book. And so let me share the screen with you now. And we'll take a look at some of the images that make up the book. So the book has 253 images. We're not going to get to all of those this evening, but we'll get to quite a few of them and certainly give you a sense of the bridge construction. And so this is the cover of the book, one of the wonderful images of the bridge as it was being built, building the Brooklyn Bridge, 1869 to 1883, an illustrated history with images in 3D. And so let's get oriented a little bit. Oops. Need to go back. Here we go. Okay, so this is a print from the Library of Congress showing you a bird's eye view looking kind of northeast from New Jersey on the left-hand side here. And let me just check with Lynn, make sure my cursor is visible to people. Is that the case? Or you're not seeing it?
I don't know. Yes, I am seeing it.
Okay, good. So that will help. All right, so New Jersey over here, Manhattan here, Brooklyn here, and you begin to see some green in the eastern side of Brooklyn, which made Brooklyn very desirable, which pushed the idea of the bridge. And so Manhattan, to a lot of people by the late 1860s, was full. There was no open land on which people could build. The idea of building up with skyscrapers really hadn't come about. And so Brooklyn became this opportunity to expand the city of New York into Brooklyn. Brooklyn, of course, was a separate city at the time, but the idea of the land that was there was very attractive to people in New York. And so almost instantaneously, the Brooklyn Bridge became the eighth wonder of the world, opening in 1883. This is just 6 years later, 1889, the celebration of the centennial of George Washington's inauguration. On the other side, Washington, and on this side, the Brooklyn Bridge. So a great tribute to the bridge. And the bridge became associated, all sorts of commercial enterprises wanted to associate themselves with the bridge, as they still do today. And so here is a company showing their spool thread attached as the cables of the bridge and to the tower of the bridge. And so, of course, the Roeblings, an appropriate name for this evening's Roebling road trip, John A. Roebling, the father, and Washington Roebling, one of his sons, and Emily Roebling, who was married to Washington Roebling. And so the book, we're going to track the chapters of the book as we broke it down. You see here that building the Brooklyn Bridge, one image at a time, Richard Haw wrote an introduction, and Richard wrote the biography of John Roebling. And then Erica Wagner, Brooklyn Bridge, a love story, wrote the biography of Washington Roebling. And so I was very happy to have them write introductions to the book. And then we broke it down, engineers, workers, caissons, the various stages of the bridge, some of which, of course, were occurring simultaneously. And so here are the chapters, and we go first to the engineers, excuse me, of the bridge, and John Roebling and Washington Roebling in succession, the chief engineers. And so here is John Roebling, trained in Germany, studied engineering, studied philosophy with Hegel, decided fairly early in his life that he needed to get out of Germany, and that America was the land of opportunity where people could do great things without the bureaucracies of Germany. And so he went and founded, as Lynn said, a town that would become Saxonburg, Pennsylvania, in Western Pennsylvania, and declared himself a farmer, having had no experience whatsoever doing that. And after about a year, decided that he had made something of a mistake, that he was bored farming, that he would leave the farming to his wife, and he would get into wire rope manufacture. And so he had read in European journals about this new idea of wire rope. And he tried it out on a canal, and then tried it out on aqueducts, and then tried it out on suspension bridges, and became Roebling and Sons became the leading wire rope manufacturer in the world. And he also became the leading suspension bridge builder in the world. And so we'll trace his history a bit, but you should understand that suspension bridges were being built in Europe, they were being built in the United States, and they were collapsing in Europe and the United States. Charles Ellet got the contract over Roebling to build the West Virginia Bridge, and that bridge collapsed. John Roebling never had a bridge of his collapse. And so his son Washington became the chief engineer upon his father's death, which we will discuss shortly. Washington studied engineering at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. And so when he went to school to study engineering, there were two places you could study engineering in the United States. One was RPI and the other was West Point, the military academy. By the time of the work on the Brooklyn Bridge, Washington Roebling was already an experienced bridge builder. He had helped his father on several of the bridges that John Roebling built. Washington Roebling's idea of a summer vacation was to go to work building a bridge with his father. He was also a Civil War veteran. And so early in the war, April of 1861, his father at dinner turned to Washington and said, "I think you've kept your legs underneath my mahogany table long enough. It's time for you to go and enlist." And he did that as a private, the lowest of ranks. And at the end of the war, he was a lieutenant colonel who had an ability to jump into a situation, found himself at Gettysburg at Little Round Top, was a hero of Little Round Top with his soon-to-be brother-in-law, General Warren, Emily's brother. And he was really the chief engineer in waiting. If John Roebling certainly was the most qualified of people to build the Brooklyn Bridge, then Washington Roebling was a close second. And so he takes over construction of the bridge when his father dies in the earliest part of the construction work. Emily Roebling, married to Washington Roebling during the Civil War, January of 1865. She and Washington in 1867 go off to Europe to study caissons. Now, she had no formal training as an engineer. She was not an engineer, but she had a tremendous ability, had a fondness and an ability with respect to science and math. And she, when Washington became ill and debilitated from the bends and also from sheer exhaustion and what was termed in the 19th century nervous prostration, became the liaison to the assistant engineers who were working on the bridge and the contractors who were supplying materials. And so Washington would meet with her every day about matters of the bridge. She would then go out to the bridge. During the 14 years that the bridge was being built, Washington Roebling never set foot on the bridge itself, which is remarkable. For 3 years, he and Emily were in Trenton while the bridge was being built. And Washington was writing letters back to the assistant engineer with all of the calculations, all of the instructions that they needed. And ultimately, Emily would visit the bridge when they came back to Brooklyn as the bridge was being completed. She would visit the bridge 2 or 3 times a day. So she played a key role and was honored as such when she led the first delegation across the bridge, to walk across the bridge. And then Washington Roebling insisted that she ride in the carriage of triumph, carrying a rooster as a symbol of the triumph of the bridge, the first person to ride across the bridge. And so crossing the East River had long been a concern for New Yorkers. We're looking from Brooklyn in the foreground across the East River, which of course is not actually a river, it's a tidal estuary, so salt water. And that made the challenge of building the bridge all the more difficult because of those tides going in and out. But as early as 1750, you can see that there was a Fulton Ferry from Fulton Street in Brooklyn to Fulton Street in Manhattan that took people across, farmers on Long Island who wanted to get their produce to market in New York City, others who wanted to commute across. And so it was a key obstacle to getting across. And early on, they were using horse-powered ferries before the steamship was invented by Fulton. And so these horses walked on treadmills and powered these paddle wheels. And the problem became with the ferries that the East River would freeze up in colder times. And then people having no other choice would try to walk across the ice, and the ice would start to come apart and people were in danger. And so something more reliable needed to be put into place, and that was the Brooklyn Bridge. The solution, a suspension bridge. And so here we are, 1879 Scientific American, an illustration, and the caption is "The Great Suspension Bridges of the United States." And it shows 4 different bridges. And the one on the top is a Roebling Bridge, and the one in the middle is the Brooklyn Bridge. And then the one on the left bottom is the Cincinnati Covington Bridge, and the one on the right is the Allegheny Bridge. And so the 4 great suspension bridges of the United States, 1, 2, 3, 4, are all Roebling bridges, according to Scientific American in 1879. So here is the first, the Niagara Bridge, built between 1851 and 1855, and an interesting construction because it was the first suspension bridge to have a railroad go across it. And it was a 2-tiered bridge also. So you see the railroad locomotive here, but you also had below it a carriage and pedestrian area that people could cross on. And I do love quoting Mark Twain at every opportunity. And so Twain talked about this bridge. You drive over the suspension bridge and divide your misery between the chances of smashing down 200 feet into the river below and the chances of having a railway train overhead smashing down onto you. Either possibility is discomforting taken by itself, but mixed together, they amount in the aggregate to positive unhappiness. And so, of course, the key here was that the bridge went up. It spanned this gorge that was otherwise impassable or difficult to pass, and it stayed up. So here is a anaglyph. We had anaglyphs made from stereo views of the bridge, which with 3D glasses like these, you can see in 3 dimensions. And so there are 44 of these in the book, which allow you to get a "you are there" experience, both in Niagara and in Cincinnati and in Brooklyn. So here we are at Niagara. You can see the American Falls here, the Canadian Falls here, in the distance upriver. And here you get a good look at the 2 levels, the railway up here and the carriageway down here. So here, another bridge, the Allegheny Bridge in Pittsburgh, 1857 to 59. And you begin to see the essentials of a Roebling suspension bridge here. You see the cables. You've got 4 cables here, 1, 2, 3, 4. You've got suspenders, which hang from the cables and are attached to the road or deck of the bridge, the superstructure. You've got this stiffening in here. John Roebling was very aware that a key to keeping these bridges up was to stiffen the deck, and he did a great deal of work on that. And then you've got the towers that keep these cables aloft. And here you have piers that are also keeping upon which the towers are built. So here we are, 1856 to 1866, the Cincinnati Covington Bridge across the Ohio River. To those of you familiar with the Brooklyn Bridge, this is kind of a mini version. Has only 1 arch, whereas the Brooklyn Bridge has 2, has only 2 cables, and is substantially shorter than the Brooklyn Bridge, but certainly is a precursor of what Brooklyn would be. So here we again see Currier and Ives, their print, The Essentials of a Suspension Bridge, cables, suspenders, even these support wires or guy wires, the deck across. You've got the central span here, you've got the land span here and over here. And then out of view are the approaches which allowed animals and people to get up onto the bridge. So John Roebling in 1857 draws this plan for his bridge across the East River. Before they're thinking Brooklyn, this would have been up around the 59th Street Bridge in between Manhattan and Queens, across what is now Roosevelt Island. And here you see a ferry slip. So the ferries were operating, there were 5 or so different ferry lines. And this is the ferry slip to the Fulton Ferry on the Brooklyn side. You see the Brooklyn terminal that had just opened while the bridge was under construction. You see the Brooklyn Tower here. And this is actually where John Roebling was mortally wounded. So in June of 1869, he and Washington and one of the assistant engineers, William Payne, go out to survey, and they are going to survey the line of the bridge, the center line. And John Roebling is in here along one of these slips. Oops. And this is a similar ferry, though not quite the same. This is a Hamilton Avenue ferry. But you see here how the ferry comes in, but you have these wooden posts into which the ferry slides. And the problem with John Roebling, of course, was that he was on one of these and thought he was out of the way as the Fulton Ferry was coming in to land. And he was not. And he got his leg crushed. And sadly, just within weeks, he died a very, very painful death of lockjaw. And so this is his grave. And the ferry, ironically, killed him, the ferry that the bridge would ultimately put out of business. And so here is Washington Roebling. There was little discussion about who would succeed his father as the chief engineer of this massive project. Washington Roebling had been really the chief engineer in waiting. His father had made suggestions that Washington was really the one who should build the bridge, but John Roebling had the name, and so he was appointed chief engineer. Washington Roebling was firmly in position to take over the construction. But as I said, he was physically debilitated. His eyesight went during the construction of the bridge. He did calculations in his head, and he and his wife lived on Brooklyn Heights in a home from which he could look out the window and see the construction of the bridge and could monitor it. And so here you see a little bit of an artist's license. They have put these binoculars here. He in fact used a telescope to monitor the construction of the bridge. And so the staff that supported the construction, this is a wonderful photograph from the Museum of the City of New York, which has a key. As you can see, there are names listed down in here. And each of these figures is numbered. And so number 2, for instance, is William Kingsley, the general superintendent. Number 3, I believe, is E.F. Farrington, the master mechanic, etc. So we do have photographs. Here is Henry Cruz Murphy, the president of the Board of Trustees. It was a private organization, the New York and Brooklyn Bridge Company, funded by private stock sales and also by the cities of New York and Brooklyn. And then you see a number of the draftsmen. Here's Farrington, again, the master mechanic, C.C. Martin, the second in command on the bridge, George McNulty, one of the assistant engineers, and William Payne, who had served in Virginia with Washington Roebling during the Civil War. And the two of them as engineers would change out of their uniforms, risking immediate execution if captured by the Confederates, to go out and scout and take drawings of what the fortifications of the Confederates looked like. So here's a closer look at them. And then the workers, of course. So there were thousands of workers who worked on the bridge during the course of the construction. Somewhere between 20 and 30 of them died, either from the bends or from various accidents on the bridge, wires snapping, men falling off of various towers. But a wonderful, wonderful photograph of the workers gathered. At any one time, you might have nobody working because it was winter, or you might have 1,000 men working. And you might have some men working through the winter. So this gives you a look into the eyes of some of the men who made the Brooklyn Bridge possible. Many Civil War veterans, many immigrants from particularly Germany and Ireland. And they had quite a turnover, particularly when they were working in the caissons, which was not a good environment to work in, with compressed air and with mud and dirt and water. So you see some of the photographs. This is a wonderful half stereo view of workers on the bridge, wonderful in 3D, because the photographer understood that in order to get a good 3D effect, you needed something in the foreground, something in the midground, and something in the distance. And that's exactly what he did here. And so here's an anaglyph that can be seen with 3D glasses if you have them. And so workers doing brickwork on the approaches to the bridge, and the anaglyph of that. And then we get to the caissons. So this is the actual real beginning of the construction on the bridge. As I said, Washington, Roebling, and Emily had gone to Europe. They had studied the idea of these caissons. Caissons had been used for about 30 years before this in Europe, but the Roeblings had not used them in Cincinnati. And so this was their first effort. And that's why Washington had to really study up on these. These were wooden boxes, 168 feet long by 102 feet, massive, massive boxes, tons of lumber, 12 inches by 12 inches, with iron bolts holding it together, and open on the bottom so that workers could go into the caisson when it was positioned where the tower of the bridge would be and dig out debris. There is this caisson remains underneath the Brooklyn Tower of the Brooklyn Bridge in perpetuity, filled now with concrete, and a second caisson of similar size is underneath the New York Tower. And so these were built by shipbuilders on ways ready to be launched. And before you would launch them and position them, you needed to have an idea of what you were going to hit as you dug down. So the idea was to dig these down, plunge these boxes into the ground slowly, and then build the tower of the bridge on top of it by laying one block of stone, either limestone for the lower areas that were going to be in the water, or granite up above. And so here they are taking sample borings. And here, the borings for the foundation of the Brooklyn Tower. And so this is a just beautiful drawing of what they were about to encounter. And here you see a detail of it showing smaller boulders and sand and gravel, boulders, etc., so that they had an idea of at 32 feet what they expected to hit, and down at 42 feet. And ultimately they plunged these down. These were the largest man-made things that had ever been dug down into the ground in the history of the world. So here we see on the East River, built by a shipbuilding company, Webb and Bell, and about to be launched. And so you can see here the angle at which it's going to come down into the river. Some predicted that as soon as it hit the water, it was going to sink to the bottom of the East River. Washington Roebling had his calculations, and his calculations were very much vindicated. And so here at Greenwood Cemetery, Eckford Webb, shipbuilder, a wonderful granite monument. This is the front of the monument. He had built some of the largest ships in the world in this era. And yet, when he writes his epitaph, he writes an eminent shipbuilder and constructor of the caissons for the first Brooklyn suspension bridge. So that was the proudest accomplishment of his life. Here's an early drawing by John Roebling. And so it shows you the timber caisson, the work area down below the caisson. This area would have been open to dirt and mud. They're blowing compressed air in here to keep the East River from entering or making it impossible to work in the work area of the caisson. And then you have this access area. Up here, you have the stones of the tower as they're being piled onto the caisson and as they're helping to drive the caisson down into the ground. And so this was really a preliminary thought. John Roebling certainly was the planner of the bridge, but Washington Roebling had to modify the plans substantially and improve on the plans. And so you see here Washington Roebling's plans, which included water shafts to allow for the removal of the debris that the men down here had loosened. Then you had supply shafts that they were going to use to drop bricks and the elements of concrete down to fill this once they had reached the level at which they would stop the digging. And then they had an air shaft that allowed the compressed air to come down and to keep the pressure on the water and to keep the water out to the extent possible. So here's a wonderful photograph showing you the setup in New York, on the New York side. And you can see the Brooklyn Tower was ahead of the New York Tower. And so you see it right here that it has risen substantially higher than the New York Tower on this side. You see the granite stones here, which are to be lifted by these derricks up onto the tower to make the tower. And then you see these stacks here, which are for the air compressors, the pumps that were compressing the air and by hoses blowing it into the caisson. And so we know this is the air compressor because you can barely make out handwriting here, but with a close-up, we see air compressor house, and it says winter. And Erica Wagner, who was tremendously helpful with this book, is an expert on all things Washington Roebling, including his handwriting. And she said that that is, in fact, his handwriting here. And so you can see, if we just go back for a second, that this is winter, and you see the snow on the pier here. All right, so there was an airlock to keep the compressed air in that the men had to go through. Unfortunately, they did not quite understand the bends and how slow decompression was the key to avoiding the bends. And so as the caisson was dug farther and farther down into the ground, that became an increasing problem. And they started to have workers die as a result of the bends. Here we are breaking up boulders. And so this became a very tedious and slow operation, to the extent that Washington Roebling went into the caisson as the work was being done with a revolver and with black powder, and experimented, making the charges larger and larger to see if it impacted on the compressed air environment and on the workers who were nearby. Discovered that it had no impact, and they were then able to blow these boulders apart and save a tremendous amount of construction time. So moving debris in wheelbarrows, they would take these and they would dump them at the bottom of the supply shaft. So into this area down in here, this pool. But they soon discovered that the problem with the pool was that this debris wanted to harden. And so they needed to blast water into the pool to keep it liquid. And then they assigned men with these long iron bars to mix the debris and the water down there so that the clamshell bucket, which we'll see in a moment, which came down through this shaft, could grab this material and lift it back up. And there was a tricky thing going on. Also, these are the dredgers designed by John A. Roebling. And so some wonderful drawings are included in the book. And these are the clamshells here. And these clamshells went down through a water column, which kept the compressed air in. Had there not been that water column there, the compressed air could have just blown right out of that shaft. But the trick was they had to keep the compressed air in with a column of water high enough to balance off the compressed air, but at the same time, not too heavy that it would itself flow into the caisson and the work area. So that was a calculation that they had to do. I do enjoy this fellow right here, and his job was, according to a historian and engineer who I consulted with on this book, was to signal to the steam operator who was lifting and lowering the clamshell when the clamshell was at the perfect height to stop operation. And so he would just wave, stop lowering it, and that was the mechanism they used. So this bridge is cutting edge in a lot of ways. It's cutting edge in its use of steel. It's cutting edge in the massiveness of the bridge. It's cutting edge in the use of electricity. The first time electricity was used across a river, but it is very primitive in terms of these wooden boxes and in terms of somebody just signaling to the steam engine operator that stop the steam engine. So here, let me just go back for a second. So here you get a closer view of that clamshell with this mechanism for lowering it down. And they, Washington Roebling experimented with all sorts of layouts for the teeth on the bucket, ultimately decided on steel teeth. And they very much tortured him. Those teeth were breaking off all the time. They had 5 or 6 of these buckets. 3 or 4 of them were out of commission at any one time because the steel had broken because those boulders and what they were dealing with were so difficult. But you see how they have opened this clamshell, dropped the debris into this car, which they would then by rail roll over to the edge of the caisson and just dump it into the river and then come back and dredge it out of the river. All right, so now we're into the towers. We can see that we're on the New York side because the tower in the Brooklyn side is substantially higher. And here's a drawing by John Roebling. One of the great features of the bridge, of course, is the grand entrance that these towers provide for the city of New York and the city of Brooklyn. And so this is really unprecedented in scale, was never repeated after the Brooklyn Bridge, Manhattan Bridge, Williamsburg Bridge, George Washington Bridge, Golden Gate Bridge are all steel towers. But this was certainly influenced by John Roebling's early years in Germany and the idea of growing up in Mulhausen, Germany, where there was a stone wall around the city. And here's just a wonderful detail. Some of these draftsmen obviously decided they wanted to have some fun. And so if we just go back for a second, you can see something indecipherable here. But then when we close in on it, we see that there's this woman with a parasol. standing here for no reason other than someone wanted to draw a woman with a parasol. The diagram by Washington Roebling of the towers looking from above and how the stones would be laid out. And you see here that there were these empty spots in the tower, which remain to this day, of course. And so that was to save on materials. He had calculated that it was unnecessary to put stone in here. So these are just hollow right through, as are substantial parts of the anchorages. So here is the tower growing up, a wonderful photograph, a photographer who certainly had some sort of in with the bridge to be able to get these guys to pose here and these workers to put down their work and pose here, and even to get the workers to hang these granite blocks to add a little bit of drama to the photographs. So the tower, New York Tower with Manhattan in the background. And you can see how it really rose above New York City and dominated the skyline. Here we are from Brooklyn looking towards Manhattan and at a 3D Anaglyph. And then Brooklyn, even lower than Manhattan in terms of the heights of the typical buildings. Now we go to the anchorages. And so these were needed to fasten the cables down, the ends of the cables. So you see the 4 cables, 1, 2, 3, 4 going into the anchorages. This was a mass of granite, a tremendous weight that would hold the ends of the cables. You see, this is a drawing showing the cables coming through the anchor chain down to the anchor plate. And then they massed granite around these pieces of steel to hold them in place. Washington Roebling observed that in Europe, they made these anchor chains accessible so that maintenance and repairs could be done. And he noted that Americans were impatient people who would not want to do maintenance on his bridge. And so he just built it into the stone and called it a day, and it has worked fine. It has not deteriorated whatsoever. So here we are. This shows you the relationship of the anchorage here on the Manhattan side and the 2 towers. And so you would run the cable down into the anchorage and then hook it to this mass of stone. Here you see the anchor plates. Down in here, these kind of starfish shaped things, and you would attach the various strands of the cables. And the anchor bars coming up. And then the footbridge. So the footbridge was quite a phenomenon because it was put in place to allow the workers to climb up and to observe the spinning of the cable wires. And so they actually spun the wires in place. Each wire was about the thickness of a pencil, close to 300 wires per strand and 19 strands per cable. And so it was 13,000 miles of wire that went into the cables of the Brooklyn Bridge. And the purpose of the footbridge was to allow the workers to reach the various parts of the bridge, and at the same time to stand on these cradles and observe the wires and make sure that each of the wires was in the same tension as the wires around it. So here you see those cradles up in here, 1, 2, 3. There's one all the way over here, and there's one off screen over here. So wonderful view looking down the footbridge in 3D. This is probably the best 3D image in the book of the 44 images. And here is a worker in what you would think was a pretty precarious position up on one of the cradles, just with this board propped up. And he has a flag in his right hand, and up around his left hand, you can see the wires of the cables, and he is to signal if the most recent wire is not sufficiently taut or is sagging. Here we see the entrance to the footbridge, a sign up, no more than only 25 men at a time, Washington Roebling, do not jump or trot and break step. But you don't see a security guard here. And so the public could come up onto the footbridge, and many people did. Here we see the shed in which the wires were kept and were played out. Here's the footbridge. And so one of the elements of the footbridge was that these slats were separated to allow the wind to come between them. And that made it all the more difficult for people who managed to wangle their way up onto the footbridge when they looked down and saw how high up they were. And so one of the workers on the bridge noted that he felt women did a better job of crossing this footbridge than men did, but it was primarily open to the public. Then they wrapped the wires with a galvanized zinc wire. This was one of the buggies, and so they had buggies coming down from each of the towers in different directions, and this has been key to protecting the steel of the cables. E.F. Farrington, the master mechanic, wanted to show his men that it was safe to be up above the East River on these wires, and so he was the first to really cross the bridge on the first wire. The carrier was used to pull the wire across the bridge, and then they spliced wires. They could only get 800 feet on a wire, and so they had to splice many, many times, and this was an ingenious device for doing that. Here you see the wire shed up on top of the Brooklyn Anchorage, only one wire shed. Looking down, we see the wire shed again. Where'd my cursor go? Oh, there it is. Right there. And then here, an artist has removed the shed so that you can see two wire spools dedicated to each of the cables. Here's the connection of the anchor bars that went down into the anchorage and the strands of the wires that go off towards the tower. And this is Washington Roebling positing various layouts for the strands. And so here's a closer look. Strand number 1 was going to go down in here, and then 2 and 3, etc. And you can see he's ever changing this. So this 14 becomes 16, etc. One of my favorite photographs, this is a lantern slide from my own collection showing the 4 cables. And so here you see this cable has been clamped. This cable has been clamped, but this one you see the strands unclamped as they are over here. And we're looking towards New York, the Tribune building, and the United States Post Office. The saddles and the strands atop the towers. And then, as I said, wrapping the cables, working through the winter. The approaches were necessary to run from the anchorages down to the street, and they had to be of a sufficiently gentle level or grade to allow people and horses to get up and over the bridge. So they extended substantially into Brooklyn and substantially into Manhattan, just short of City Hall in Manhattan. They also constructed this wooden railway to move materials around. Having a little trouble here, I apologize with the moving the images for some reason. And so there, if you look all the way up here, you can see there's a car that they used. Here's the approach as it was being built. Here's that car that could move along here and could carry materials from one end of the construction site to the other. And so if you needed a granite block near the New York Tower, you could move it on this railway. And we have some wonderful images of that. the suspended superstructure. So they built out from the tower. As you can see, the deck coming out from the New York Tower as it came out also from the other side from the Brooklyn Tower. And the idea was to divide the deck into 5 pieces. And so you were going to have an outside 2-lane carriage coming from Brooklyn, from New York to Brooklyn. Other direction here, a railway for transporting passengers from one end of the bridge to the other, and an elevated promenade, which had no precedent, but which John Roebling had planned, and Washington Roebling made sure that it happened to allow people of leisure and invalids to walk the bridge and to enjoy the magnificent views and the fresh air coming off the harbor. And so here we are attaching the suspenders. So those again are those wires hanging down and to which the beams of the deck are attached. The bridge was 85 feet across. John Roebling was pretty thrilled that the bridge was going to be as wide as Broadway and Manhattan. And here you see the deck proceeding with several of the assistant engineers and the deck going into Brooklyn. So here is a view of the operation of the bridge. Pedestrians in the middle, then the railways to either side. And now we get to the railway and terminals. Assistant engineer William Payne was an expert in cable cars. He had built the cable cars out in San Francisco, built cable cars in Denver and Cleveland. And so they decided that they would use cable cars, which would allow them to avoid the massive weight of a steam locomotive. So here are the terminals that they were building at the 2 ends of the bridge. This is the Brooklyn terminal. And Brooklyn terminal close to completion. And inside the Brooklyn terminal, so you see that bend, which is typical of the Brooklyn terminal, did not occur in the Manhattan side, which was a straight terminal. And then we have just a little video of a few seconds here from 1899, actually a movie, excuse me, this was before video, showing the cable car. And so we're on the cable car, or the photographer is, and you see this line right in the middle here, which is the cable. And you see the trolley. They had added trolleys and taken out one of the carriage lanes. And the bridge has evolved over time so that in the 1950s, when the automobile was ascendant, 3 lanes were created in each direction. The bridge was reinforced to some extent. The trolley was taken out. And then the latest development is the bike lane across the bridge. So they've taken out an automobile lane with bikes now ascendant. And what's particularly wonderful from my perspective is that they've taken the bikes off the elevated promenade, and it is now strictly pedestrians, and is a much, much better experience. And so the opening of the bridge occurred May 24th, 1883. And the president of the United States, Chester A. Arthur, who was, of course, from New York, was there, and a salute was fired. The North Atlantic Fleet was there, and they fired salutes, and the Brooklyn Navy Yard fired salutes. This is the mayor of Brooklyn, Seth Lowe, meeting the president. A union of hearts, a union of hands, as the 2 cities were united. And then, of course, the bridge remains an icon. And so if you're going to advertise the Knicks versus the Nets, you use the Brooklyn Bridge as a background. Here it is in all its glory today. And so my book again, and I just wanted to humbly read, what just happened? Looks like I have lost screen sharing.
I can see the back of the book with the blurbs.
Oh, really? Okay. Oh, okay. I seem to have shifted screens. Thank you. If you so Kurt Anderson, the author, if you love Brooklyn or bridges in New York City or cities, ooh, no, I apologize for this. Or 19th century marvels, or all, I can't read it, I'm sorry. In any event, let me just conclude with, hopefully I can get the Montgomery Schuyler quotation up. So this is Montgomery Schuyler, the day the bridge opened, published in Harper's Weekly. He was one of the pioneering critics in America. It so happens that the work, which is likely to be our most durable monument and to convey some knowledge of us to the most remote posterity, is a work of bare utility, not a shrine, not a fortress, not a palace, but a bridge. And so I think that's a wonderful tribute to the Brooklyn Bridge. I apologize again for the problems I had with this advancing images, but hopefully you enjoyed the slideshow, and I see that we have quite a few questions. So I'm happy.
Yes, we do.
Those.
That was so great. I hope to God that the part of this that's actually recorded, and one of the questions that came up was, are these going to be available for people to share with their friends? And they're all on our YouTube channel, but I was like this close to the screen looking at the detail of your photos, and I really hope that's not recorded for the world. Okay, but we do have a lot of questions coming in. Let's start with an easy one. Did Emily ever go into the Caissons?
Not that I know of. Washington, so I mentioned Washington did not ever walk on the bridge, but he did go into the Caissons. As the Brooklyn Caisson was being completed, I think it was in 1870, it caught fire. And Washington Roebling went into the Caisson to fight the fire and was there for quite a bit of time. And that's when he got the Benz attack, which was tremendously painful for him. But to the best of my knowledge, she did not go in there. I doubt very, she was really a pioneer, a woman amongst otherwise a totally male dominated construction crew. And so I have no information that she did, and I kind of doubt that she would. Just want to mention also that she did go to law school after the bridge was completed, NYU, which is the same law school I went to, and she graduated with a degree in law. So she was quite an extraordinary person.
Okay. Were there tolls on the Brooklyn Bridge?
There were tolls. And so when they opened the bridge on May 24th of 1883, they had tens of thousands of people line up. The bridge was to open at midnight that night to the public. Some people could come in during the day by ticket, several thousand people, but you had to pay a penny to walk across the bridge when it opened. And so they had all these people lined up to pay their penny and to be admitted to the bridge. There was quickly a campaign by the trustees and by the superintendent to end the toll for that. But there were also tolls. Pigs were 2 cents a piece, and sheep were 5 cents, and carriages were 5 or 10 cents. And so there was all of that. And also, when they got the railway going in September of 1883, it was 5 cents to cross in 5 minutes.
That's amazing. I love that detail about the pigs. Did the construction of the bridge approaches require demolition of existing buildings or houses? And was that controversial? Because the person who wrote this, Martha, she thinks that it would be now very controversial.
Yes, I think that's true, that it would be controversial today. I think it was a different mindset back then. And so the bridge was given a right of eminent domain by the legislation that authorized the bridge. And the bridge purchased properties one at a time. They have very copious reports about how much they paid for each of those properties. And by and large, they left those properties intact. They kind of in stages took off the tops of these buildings and kind of insulated them so that they couldn't reach, if a fire broke out in the building, it wouldn't reach the deck of the bridge. And then when they had to build the approach, they had to clear the land. So that's when they got serious about taking the buildings down. But I think we live in different times and people have a different mindset in terms of the government or the bridge grabbing your property.
All right, this is a speculation question. We want you to use your imagination here. Is there any reason to believe that the process or outcome would have been different if John Roebling survived?
Well, no, I don't think it would have been. I think he was eager, the documents show, to turn the everyday work on the bridge over to his son. And so he realized, who's the greatest bridge builder in the world, who's got the reputation? John Roebling. So he was happy to do that and to get the bridge planned out and to get it surveyed. And unfortunately, that's as far as he got. But I think that as the bridge had continued, John Roebling was 63 years old, I believe, when he died in 1869. And so he would have been 73, 77 years old when the bridge was completed, which I guess actually is the age of our president now. But I think he would have bowed out, and reduced the amount of work that he was doing on the bridge as it proceeded and turned more and more over to Washington, as he had done in Cincinnati. Washington was in charge of the cable making in Cincinnati, not John.
All right, here's some questions about materials. One person is an engineer. I'm just going to put that up front for you. Where was the granite quarried from? I want to say upstate New York. Is that true?
There were a number of granite quarries. And so upstate New York, Maine, I think in Hollowell, Maine, there was a quarry. There were several quarries in Maine, as I recall. And they had a place in Brooklyn where they kept all the stone, and then that barge that we saw with the stone, they would barge it up as needed, and each of the stones was numbered, and so they could figure out the exact dimensions. There's a wonderful stereo view with a Lewis, a metal loop on one of the stones, and you can see the stone chips that the masons have removed to get the stone just right to fit into the spot that it was designed for.
To what extent was Portland cement used in the foundations, or were they entirely granite?
I'm not sure about Portland cement. They did mix concrete. So it's a bit confusing, and I hope I get it right. And our engineer friend will probably be able to tell me if I do.
It was Rosendale cement.
What's that?
Paul King is saying that it was Rosendale cement.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, Paul King, I rely completely on him. Concrete, they mixed cement and pebbles and sand, I believe, to create concrete. And so when they were filling the Brooklyn caisson, if I recall correctly, it was too cold to do that above ground. And so they dropped the material through those supply lines inside and mixed it in the caisson. But when they closed the New York up, they mixed all of the materials on the top of the above the caisson.
Who funded the building?
As I said, New York. So there's a element of Boss Tweed in this, which David McCullough in his book discusses at length. Tweed, of course, is a fascinating fellow, and he's buried at Greenwood Cemetery, where I'm the historian. So I know a good deal about Tweed. And, this was ultimately a $15 million project, and it's hard to believe that Boss Tweed didn't assert himself. He was on the executive committee of the bridge, and he was given stock of the bridge. And McCullough certainly believes that payoffs were made to Tweed and the Tweed ring. but there were also private stockholders. You could, like any stock, buy in to this company. But Brooklyn invested substantial amounts. The political leaders of Brooklyn were really pushing for the bridge a good deal more than the New York leaders. But both cities invested in the construction.
Right. And I think the images that you showed really include a lot of workers, which was really impactful for me. I love seeing the workers actually doing the work and getting it done. One of the questions that came in was how many workers died during construction?
Yeah, they did not keep copious records, which was typical of the 19th century industrial projects. And so the best that we can do is somewhere in the range of 20 to 30 workers died during the construction.
This is a question for me. Have you heard about that? I don't know if it's a myth, a legend, a truth, that somebody rented out the towers before they were finished or something to store champagne? Because I think this could be a really good program at the museum if it's true, right?
I don't think that's the case. I don't think you can get into the towers. More likely the anchorages.
Yeah,
And so
maybe.
in 1983, as part of the centennial celebration, they opened up the anchorages, which are hollow inside, again, because the calculation by the chief engineers was that you didn't need to make it solid. And they had art exhibitions in there. And I've been inside the Anchorage, and, it's kind of closed up. I think, I'm not sure exactly what jurisdiction in New York would allow you to do that, but
let's find out.
There
Let's
is a
find
space
out.
in there, and it's pretty spectacular. And John Roebling was a big fan of, the approaches. He created all sorts of, or anticipated all sorts of commercial space and storage there. And also for the anchorages, he touted them as the most secure place in the country where you could store your gold. So there was that also. But not the towers. I don't think the towers.
I think it was Paul King just put the link to the article by NPR. It's the one that I read. I think it was the Anchorages then. Okay, here's a good question also about workers. Are there records of the names of the workers, or some of them, or where would those be found?
There's actually a website by a woman who I believe is in New Jersey about the Brooklyn Bridge workers. And so if you Google that, she has some wonderful information. I think it dates from about 2016 that she did most of her research, but tremendous amount of repeating or finding Brooklyn Eagle coverages of this person who died and the information. And so that material is out there. She does make the point that somebody who died in some, kind of tragic way seems to have made the newspapers, whereas somebody on the Brooklyn Bridge who was knocked off the tower doesn't seem to have gotten any coverage. But she has this wonderful website as a tribute to the workers and the sacrifices that they made.
That's great. Yeah, someone came to the museum a couple weekends ago and she told me that her great-grandfather was the first person to die, and that there was a newspaper and it was in his obituary. And she, I think, pointed me to that website. There's a lot of really great stuff on there. And if I remember, I'll send it out to everyone who participated with the link to this program. Okay, we'll do one last question. Are you aware of granite stairs built into the towers used to access the saddles or the tower roofs?
I am not. And so I know that work was just being done on the towers, and that the team that was doing that work built stairways on the sides of the towers. And so if those interior stairs exist, I have no information that they're there. And one would think that they wouldn't have gone to the expense of building these things if they were. So but I haven't been inside the towers.
Not yet.
Not yet. Right, right. Well, on our next Roebling adventure, we could do that.
Yes. In real life when we do Roebling road trips.
Right, right, right.
All right. Well, I think we answered all the questions that showed up here. There were some questions that I answered about where the Roeblings were buried in Trenton and in New York, and I answered those in the Q&A area. But another thing is, for those who are still with us, the book is available. We should have said this at the beginning. It slipped my mind, but I put the link into the chat right when you first started talking. Your publisher sent me the Strand bookstore still has some in stock, and I also checked on Amazon and they seem to be back in stock. So there's a few different ways you can get your hands on this book. It sounds awesome, especially for just the idea you get to see them in 3D for real if you get the book. So I recommend it.
Well, thank you. I do appreciate that. Yeah, I was featured on CBS Saturday Morning this past Saturday, and sales spiked as a result of that, but they are available online or at local bookstores. The community bookstore in Brooklyn also has autographed copies if people are interested in those. So that would be great.
All right. Well, thanks so much for being with us. This is a fantastic Roebling road trip. One of the things I didn't mention, a lot of the questions in the comments were talking about how great your presentation was and how much people learned just from seeing the images. And I completely agree. And I hope you'll come to the museum once we're fully reopened again, maybe next year.
I will. So thank you very much. It's been a pleasure, and have a wonderful evening.
Yeah, too. Thanks.
Bye now.